Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show on this Friday, September 18th, 2015. I'm David Knight, your host, and like Greg Allman, sometimes I do feel like I'm tied to the whipping post. You're going to feel like it, too, if Obama has his way, because he's got about another year and a half to go. We may be all excited about the GOP debates and think, yeah, we're going to get a new big brother, but you know what? He can do a lot of damage in the next couple of years. A lot of damage has happened in just the last couple of months. In Europe, for example, we have massive waves of immigrants that are coming in. People are trying to deal with that particular problem. They don't even have time, most of them, to really take a close look at the origins of that problem. Of course, there is a massive humanitarian issue there. We can aid people in the country, though. One of the first things we could do to aid them is to stop fomenting the war. You didn't hear any talk during the GOP debate about the confessions of the top ISIS military commander about how he was trained by the U.S. military, how the U.S. military was bringing in Chechen Muslims who had been fighting the Russians, bringing them into Syria 3 years ago. You didn't hear about that, did you? You didn't hear about how we equip, arm, and train these people, how we created this force just like we created Al-Qaeda, initially as the Mujahideen. No, this is something that's just organically sprung up, and we have to respond to it. A similar situation, I think, may be happening. There's an article on Infowars.com from Steve Watson that we just mentioned in the last segment, is this whole thing with the suitcase bomb kid, the clock kid, as they call him. Is that whole thing a setup? Joining us now is Paul Joseph Watson. We want to talk about a video as well as these other issues, a video that was put out by a top imam, and this is an article by Paul Joseph Watson. Muslim immigrants should breed with Europeans to, quote, conquer their country. Thank you for joining us, Paul Joseph Watson.
Good to be back, David.
Before we talk about this, let's just give people a little bit of a sample of this video. It's up on the article that you put up. It's in a foreign language, so we're going to run this up here, and I'm going to read the subtitles to people. We're going to play a little bit of that so they can get a feel for it, and then we'll read them and talk about some of the what he actually says. So let's run that video, guys. He says the infidels want to torment us. They want us to be humiliated. The Quran says the Jews and the Christians will never be pleased with you, but we will never follow their religion. This dark night will be over. Soon we will trample them underfoot, Allah willing. Germany is not a compassionate country that wishes to absorb refugees from Syria and Iraq and Palestinian refugees in the Levant and elsewhere. You know what? Neither are the Saudi Arabians. He's not going to say that. Europe has become old and decrepit. Now, here's the key part here. They see Europe as old, decrepit. He says they need human reinforcements. No force is more powerful than the human force of us Muslims. Oh, Muslims, the Germans say in their economic reports that they need 50,000 young workers. That's exactly it. Let's go back to Paul Joseph Watson. That's a flavor, Paul, of what he's saying. And, of course, he's making a demographic argument. He's saying that Europe is weak. It's dying. And, you know, quite frankly, that's true if we look at the demographics. As I pointed out earlier, Mark Stein, the Canadian ultra-conservative, had pointed out that birth rates were falling so dramatically in Europe that, for example, the Italians, who used to be one of the have one of the highest birth rates, they now have a birth rate that is so low, it's just barely above 1. So that population in Italy, the indigenous Italian population, is being cut in half every generation. Meanwhile, you have third world countries, especially Muslim countries, where they have an average of 5 children per family. If they come in any great numbers, and this was written maybe a decade, 15 years ago, if they come in any great numbers, what he talked about was Europe becoming Eurabia. Your comments, Paul?
Well, this is what the Muslim imam went on to say at the end of this video, which was during a speech at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. He said, quote, "They wish that we were dead, but they have lost their fertility." He's talking about Europe. So they look for fertility in our midst. We will give them fertility. We will breed children with them because we shall conquer their countries. He goes on to say, whether they like it or not, Americans, Italians, Germans, and the French will be forced to take refugees and, quote, "We shall soon collect them in the name of the coming caliphate. We will say to you, these are our sons, feed them or send them, or we will send our armies to you." So he said that during a speech, and you made the point. he's basically everything he says is true. This might be
Yes.
incendiary, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned Italy, for example. They had a birth rate of around 2 children per couple back in 1960. Now it's 1.3. Now, if you take that 1.3 figure over the next 45 years, Italy's native population is going to halve in just 45 years. Similar case with Germany. They're losing 100,000 people annually. So we're being told absolute lies and bunk about this refugee crisis being about, humanitarian, compassionate, all based on feelings. That's why Germany's bringing in 800,000 asylum seekers before the end of the year. As this imam says, that's completely false. They're bringing them in because they need the cheap labor, because in the West, governments have not incentivized, not encouraged their populations to have children like they have done in the Middle East and other areas. And that's for numerous different reasons. One of the main ones is, as the West has become more secular, children have become increasingly viewed as a burden in the present and not to secure the future of the population of that particular country. So Europe is completely dying out. That's why they need to bring in these hordes of migrants for cheap labor. It has nothing to do, in many cases, with Syrian refugees. Half of the Syrian refugees coming in, well, it's about 50% that are Syrian, but of those 50%, 90% can't even prove that they're Syrian in some areas. So this is being completely exploited by economic migrants to flee to the welfare havens of countries like Sweden and Germany. And according to these Islamic preachers, they're going to do it to conquer the countries. Those are his words, not mine. And in fact, if you go into the Quran, it states, quote, "And whoever emigrates for the cause of Allah will find on the earth many locations and abundance." So there are several sections in the Quran which encourage Muslims to emigrate to other non-Muslim countries as a form of stealth jihad. And we've talked about about that in the past. We've covered articles about it. So shocking statements, but he's telling the truth, basically. We're being told that this is all about compassionate humanitarianism when it's not. They're bringing in these huge amounts of refugees, migrants to fill cheap labor, and it's going to have terrible consequences in terms of social cohesion in Europe, which we're already beginning to see.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned several different factors there. We've got cheap labor. We've got supporting the welfare state Ponzi scheme. And, of course, there's the divide and conquer aspect of it. The cheap labor and the divide and conquer are the sorts of things that we see. The governments want to divide and conquer to control the people. The corporations want cheap labor. And the people there at the lower level, from those who are at the very top who are pushing for a globalist government, I think those people are looking at saying, well, if we could keep this welfare state going, because, we need workers at the bottom to support people who are on Social Security, the retirees and that sort of thing. People need to understand that the first place they had Social Security was in Germany, and it was put in by Bismarck. He picked the age of 65 because that was the life expectancy. They didn't expect to pay anybody anything. They wanted you to pay into this Ponzi scheme. And again, it's a Ponzi scheme because you have to keep, it doesn't pay for itself. You have to keep getting more and more people into the scheme to keep it going. That's one of the reasons that they're looking for this, and of course the cheap labor. But Paul, when we look at the divide and conquer aspect of this, as these refugees are coming up through Syria, going in through Hungary, if we look at the geography of this, they're coming up through Hungary, the Eastern European countries. Those countries were on the front line of the conflict with Islam hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago. They knew what that was like. They've also suffered under the privations of socialism. They're not interested in having this massive influx of people who cannot be assimilated, who they are aware of in their history has been a source of conflict within their countries. That's one of the reasons why they're closing their borders.
Yeah, that's what's happening in the case of Hungary. Of course, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, came out a few weeks ago and said, Europe is based on Christian foundations and principles. Moving in potentially millions of people who aren't assimilated, who have a different culture, who follow a different religion, that's going to have a massive impact on social cohesion. He was called xenophobic by the New York Times and others simply for making that point. And as he said, it's also about how these European countries like Hungary are being punished for defying the EU.
Yes.
It's all about centralizing power under the EU to the point where sovereign nations have no control over their own border policies. So whereas countries like the United Kingdom have got opt-outs, others are wedded into this EU superstate bureaucracy where they have to go along with anything that comes out of Germany. So it's a power struggle between these countries who are trying to reclaim some of their sovereignty and the EU, which is forcing them to go along with it. But even now, Germany, of course, they rolled out the red carpet over the first couple of weeks as this migrant crisis, went from being a trickle to a deluge, basically. But even now, Germany's reimposing some of the border controls. And how could they not have known that this is what would happen? You roll out the red carpet, you say, we've got benefits, we've got welfare, we've got housing. There are reports that they're now kicking out elderly, homeless people who are being given temporary social housing in Germany, German citizens, to accommodate these migrants. And now Germany suddenly doubles back and says, oh no, we're going to reimpose some border controls and crack down on this. Well, it's a bit too late now. Hundreds of thousands have got in, more are on their way. And I'm getting emails from people in Germany who live near these migrant centers. We've already talked about before the schools in Germany that are banning girls from wearing shorts so as not to offend Muslim migrants and provoke attacks. Now people who live in what in many cases are just small villages and towns, these aren't major city metropolitan areas, they live near these new migrant camps that have just been constructed to house all these incoming migrants over the past few weeks. And they say that, because bearing in mind, these aren't prisons, I mean, they're allowed out of these camps. They're saying that hundreds of men are just congregating on street corners because, again, there's no plan to assimilate them. They're just being allowed to roam around and congregate. And people are scared. Young girls, their wives, they're scared of going out because there are literally hundreds of men just stood around in certain areas of these villages and towns. There was another guy in Finland who sent me a message. And he basically said, look, they changed a local bar into a migrant camp. There are like 100 men there because, bearing in mind, the UN's own figures say that 72% of these migrants are men, only 13% women and 15% children. So this lie that it's all Syrian families is completely bogus. And this Finnish guy just said to me, I have a blonde wife, I have 2 blonde, blue-eyed children, and I have a shotgun. And that's, oh my God, that sounds racist. Look at Sweden, 1,400% increase in rapes since they opened their door to mass immigration.
Yes.
Because again, there's no assimilation plan. So people are frightened. People are not going out. They don't dare to go near these migrant centers. Schools in Germany are now saying, don't offend the migrants or provoke attacks. We had an incident in Berlin yesterday where a jihadist tried to stab a policewoman. They had to shoot him. So people are frightened and people are gearing up because you can't just flood small villages full of hundreds of men from a completely different culture and not have problems. I mean, that's completely naive to suggest that.
Exactly. They're standing around. They don't have anything to do. I think there's a lot of things that we can see in this, Paul, in terms of microcosm and in terms of how quickly this thing has gotten out of control that have parallels for Americans here in this country with our open borders. We've been talking about this. Things have been accelerating for us here in America, but we see with this rapid movement throughout Europe, we can see what is happening there. You talked about incentives, and we talk about building a wall here. The Republicans are talking about doing that. I think it's very telling for people to take a look at what happened in Hungary, where they put up razor wire. They're shooting water cannons at these people, tear gas. Nevertheless, they came through the razor wire as these people were fighting them. If you give people an incentive, whether it is destroying their home country and then offering them these incentives of the welfare state, that's what's going on right now. We see that in spades in Europe, but essentially that's what's going on in Central and South America as well. We've got a war going on there, the drug war, that has killed more people than have died in Afghanistan. It's a slower simmering war that's been going on for a long time, but we're destroying their countries nevertheless. And then at the same time, we offer them the incentives, these incentives of a welfare state, of free college, essentially getting a in-state tuition. Anywhere you want to go as an illegal, and of course, American citizens don't get that kind of discretion where they go to school. And they're telling us here, just like they're telling the people in Europe, these are all children. And they're not children if they can get through this this multi-thousand-mile journey, they're being escorted by people, perhaps traffickers. But the definition of children that Obama has put out there is people up to the age of 31. Those are the dreamer's age. So this is all predicated on a lie, but we have to understand that we cannot interdict with force when we create a war of destruction in their countries, where we deliberately destroy their countries and then offer them incentives to immigrate into the West.
No, and this is a point that we've touched upon many times, and it's still absent from the mainstream media narrative, which is don't destabilize secular governments in the Middle East and put jihadists into power. It's very simple, and yet they keep doing it over and over again. And many of these Syrian refugees, at least the legitimate ones, want to return to Syria. They don't want to stay in Europe because they had a relatively high standard of living in Syria. So, yeah, just cut it off at its source. Don't give bombs and weapons to jihadists. Invest in these countries, keep them stable, and improve their quality of life. And then we wouldn't have a migrant crisis in the first place.
Let me ask you about another article that's up on Infowars.com to comment on this. Of course, is your brother's article questioning whether or not the clock kid was a setup from the very beginning. His father is an Islamic phobic activist. He's an activist to counter Islamophobia. He says, I want to make sure that this type of thing is shut down globally. And so we've got Obama inviting him into the White House because he made a clock that looked very much like a suitcase bomb. Your comments, Paul?
Well, this is one of those social justice warrior issues that they've all seized upon. And first of all, why, reward him for this clock but with an invitation to the White House? It doesn't even look like a clock.
No.
If I bought that in a store and they said it was a clock, I'd take it back. I mean, it's not a clock at all.
As I said before, it looks like a prop from 24, the anti-terrorism.
It looks like a cheap, suitcase bomb. I'm sorry, but it does. So now there are questions about, was it all a setup? Because his dad is this Islamophobic activist. The point I made was the kid who chewed out a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun, he didn't get an invite to the White House. People suspended for wearing American flag T-shirts, they don't get invitations to the White House.
Hang on there, Paul. We got to take a break. We'll be right back with Paul Joseph Watson. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. We're talking to Paul Joseph Watson, the UK. We've been talking about his articles at Infowars.com, a top imam saying Muslim migrants should breed with Europeans to conquer their countries. And, of course, he correctly points out that the Europeans, and I would say also to a lesser degree, but certainly it's still there, Americans have lost their fertility. We've seen many people argue that there's a sociological charge to it, a part to that's all that it is. I think that is a part of it. I don't think that's all there is to it, Paul. I think that it's also what they're putting in our food and our water as well. What do you think?
Well, from what I can recall writing about this in the past, the figures are crazy. It's something like a 14% decline in sperm count in men in certain European countries since the late 80s. So it's been going on for 20 plus years, and there could be medical causes for that.
Yeah, it's a full-out assault, I think. It's not only sociological, but I think it's actually physiological in terms of that. And we've mentioned many times, when they put fluoride, when they put other things in our food, it's deliberate that they put this stuff in there.
Yeah, so we've seen declining sperm counts for at least 2 decades now. And then you add in the sociological aspect where children are increasingly seen as a financial burden. They're not seen as providing joy and happiness and stability and securing the future, not only of your family, your lineage, but the population of your country. As we've become more decadent and more nihilistic in the West, not just because of secularism, but just generally, people are having kids later and later. People used to have kids in their early 20s, 25, 30 years ago. They're waiting longer and longer and having less kids.
Yes.
And people are dying out. Europe's dying out. Italy is a 1.3 level. The replacement rate is 2.1. We're nowhere near that in most European countries. So we're dying out, and they're bringing in masses of illegal immigrants to try and get cheap labor. They're doing it for other reasons. Another story that I've got coming up is people smugglers in these Middle Eastern countries are targeting would-be economic migrants, not refugees from Syria, migrants from surrounding countries, with information websites that promise them, quote, free blonde Swedish girls and taxpayer-funded luxury treatment if they pay these people smugglers to help them reach Scandinavia. So I'm guessing a lot of those, quote, free blonde Swedish girls won't be consensual, given Sweden's 1,400% rise in rapes since the 70s, since they had mass immigration. And again, that's not a racist fact. It's an actual fact that 73% or more of these culprits are listed as, quote, foreigners and immigrants, even though, you know, less than 10% of the population in Sweden is immigrants. So they've got a massive problem with Muslim rape gangs. We had it in Britain with the Rotherham rape gang, which was covered up by the government because they said it was politically incorrect to try and go after these rape gangs that were grooming young girls up in the northern English town of Rotherham, where I used to live. So we've got a huge problem with this, and it's only going to get worse now that they're bringing in potentially millions of Muslim migrants over the next 10, 20 years.
Absolutely. Of course, if you point out a statistical fact showing the explosion in rapes in Sweden with massive immigration, they push back and say you're xenophobic, you're racist, and I think that's a big part of what's going on with this clock situation. I think this clock kid, quite frankly, Paul, is the Tawana Brawley of Islam. We all remember that she's the person that Al Sharpton used to make himself a celebrity. Now Obama is doing the same thing. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg as well. Thank you for joining us, Paul Joseph Watson.
A clean, toxic-free body is the foundation of true health. Introducing Deep Cleanse by InfoWarsLife.com, a scientifically formulated blend of nanocolloidal zeolites and organic ingredients that aid the body in cleansing chemicals and toxic metals. Using our proprietary multi-step extraction technology, Deep Cleanse is our most affordable all-in-one cleanser. With concentrated organic compounds like cilantro, milk thistle, fulvic acid, orange peel, zeolites, and others, Deep Cleanse doesn't hold back. Instead of buying 5, 6, or even 7 different cleansing products, we use decades-old scientific research to put together the Rolls-Royce of all-in-one cleansing. Look, there's a reason Deep Cleanse is the only product on the market that uses our proprietary Spigyrex herbal processing technique. We use only the highest quality organic herbs backed by serious research, and we still bring it to you at the best price out there. If you wish to find Deep Cleanse and experience the all-in-one cleansing, visit InfoWarsLife.com. That's InfoWarsLife.com or call 888-253-3139.